Rob Carr, thanks for joining us again on the Illinois Channel. Good to see you. It's been normally we'd be covering you throughout the legislative session, but that didn't happen this year for obvious reasons. Well, we wanted to catch up with you, and here it is today, July the 1st, and that means that a previously passed increase in the minimum wage takes effect. Let me, if I might, just bring this graphic up briefly. And we see that on, as of today, it's minimum wage is going to $14 an hour in Chicago, $13 an hour elsewhere in Cook County, and for all the rest of the state, the minimum wage in Illinois is now $10 an hour. So what impact is that increase going to have from what you know from talking to your retail members?
Well, and first, Terry, it's great to see you, and thanks for reaching out. It's going to have significant impact. Look, this is not when these when this minimum wage increases were passed. We were in the midst of a extraordinary, historic economic recovery. We were really thriving. Now we're not. Clearly, we're in the worst condition we've been in since the Great Depression. And, people think, well, we're starting to open up, and that's true. But when you're a restaurant, you can't make a profit when you're operating at 50%. This is buying time for people. It's buying time for, retail when you're at 50%, or you're delivering curbside. It's not a sustainable economic model. And then when we're adding now artificial costs on top of that, amidst historic unemployment levels, this is going to put a real damper on rehiring. It's going to put a real roadblock in front of retailers who are trying to get back on their feet. So this is a real kick in the teeth to retail, particularly on the heels of the pandemic.
And something that I thought about even at the time before the pandemic came in, so many of the lawmakers are from the Chicagoland area. Chicago typically gets like 50 million visitors a year coming in from outside, going to conventions, going to as tourists and all. And maybe that works, a $15 an hour minimum wage works in a Chicago because of all that influx where people are accustomed to spending money while they're there on business or tourists. But, not far from where you and I are located in Springfield is a little town down of Auburn. There's a Dairy Queen that always kind of sticks in my mind on this issue. It's surrounded by cornfields. And I think, How is that guy supposed to double his sales to accommodate the higher retail costs? And it's impossible. And as a reporter doing local news, I have in the past gone to some of these small communities across central Illinois where the population is measured in the hundreds of people, and they have a little bar maybe where the farmers get together, or a cafe where they get together. Again, the population density is just not enough there to do any increase in bringing in more business to offset virtually almost a doubling of what was the minimum wage. What are you hearing from these smaller, we think of the big, Walmart and Target and all those kind of people, but there's an awful lot of retail businesses that are mom and pop operations.
That's exactly right, Terry. And this draws no distinction, but even if it did, we make a mistake. A lot of people think, well, grocery stores are doing real well right now, for example. They can afford this. Maybe for a moment. What is ignored is during the pandemic, most grocery stores paid significantly more. They did what's bonuses to employees. They paid them extra hours during the panic buying and then in the weeks that followed. But ultimately, grocery is going to go back to what it's always been. It's always been a low net profit margin business, typically under 1%. It's going to go back to that. When you look at restaurants, they're struggling. That Dairy Queen has nowhere to go to grow a business. Illinois' population is declining. And there's only so much you're going to pay for a milkshake or a hamburger or a meal out. We have one of our college-age sons who is working part-time at an independent stand in Jacksonville. It is a combination of lunch crowd, hamburgers, tacos, those kind of things, and ice cream products. There's only so much they're going to charge, so they're doing with less. They're having employees with fewer hours. They're doing what they can to manage. But again, this puts in place a significant cost, a significant obstacle to recovery. We, the Illinois retail merchants, had suggested both in the city of Chicago and in Springfield that this gets delayed for a year. Give the economy, the consumer, the businesses time to recover. Unfortunately, inexplicably, that fell on deaf ears. And so what we have now are retailers and other businesses seeing this significant increase put in place at the worst possible time. And people are going to wonder why the recovery is so much slower in Illinois. This is going to be one of the top examples.
Yeah, I didn't know. How does that work? Do we have to pass another law to undo the previous law, or can we just have the governor say we're not going to enact that at this time?
It's arguable under the Emergency Management Act whether or not the governor could do that unilaterally through an executive order, but his administration is showing an unwillingness to do so. In fact, his administration has doubled down on the need for the increase, ignoring, I think, the fact that people are not employed. We have record unemployment, and this is doing nothing to spur employment. So I don't think, Terry, that he would be able to do that, even if he was inclined. But to your point, we would need an act passed, which is why we were trying to impress upon legislative leaders during their brief time in Springfield at the end of May that they needed to address this issue.
We have many businesses, retail establishments in the Metro East, just across from Missouri. We have other places just across from Iowa in the Quad Cities. Are these special cases over there too? Are they going to be negatively even more impacted, or how does it matter that these border communities are next to other states that are not necessarily going to have as high a labor cost when they're trying to compete? What impact is that going to have?
It always matters. Terry, you've heard me talk many times over the years that 2/3 of Illinois' population lives within a 40-minute drive of a border. So it's really easy for Illinois' population to make the drive across a border. And if you look at, we've had maps before that show the stores, particularly restaurants and convenience stores that are located in proximity to borders. And there's a reason they're built there. It's because people make the drive. We've talked before about when the Quincy Bridge was closed, I think during the flood of '93, that gas tax and tobacco receipts in in the city of Quincy in Illinois, jumped more than 200% during the 10-day period that bridge was closed. That's because people couldn't do what they were doing normally, which was going across the border into Missouri to make those purchases. So clearly it has a negative impact. Clearly it drives more people to do that. Clearly they do that. And we're going to continue to see that. Illinois really needs to rethink what they're doing and how difficult they're making it for small business. Now, they will counter that they've provided assistance to small business. The problem is their definition is 50 or fewer employees typically. And while that's important, that doesn't capture 50% of the hiring that's done. That doesn't capture 50% of the tax revenue that's generated. And what we have to remember is retail accounts for the largest tax revenue generation for local governments and the second largest for the state. So there is little hope for recovery economically for local governments and the state until the retail sector gets back on its feet. And putting in place an artificial minimum wage increase in the midst of the pandemic is frankly short-sighted and self-destructive.
You're one of the Retail Merchants Association, I think, is viewed as one of the major one of the major associations representing your members in the capital city. When you approached the administration, were you able to talk directly with the governor or with one of the people working for him? And as you made these arguments, I think you said it fell on deaf ears, but what kind of response did they actually give to you?
Well, I mean, the response came, I think, in the responses we heard from the governor's press briefings where he was asked about this by your peers in the media. And his response was that he believes that the minimum wage increase is needed now more than ever. Again, we respectfully disagree with that. It's hard to justify, given we're in the midst of historic unemployment, how you're going to get people back to work if you're increasing the costs of putting people back to work. And retailers in the industry I represent are operating at far less than what they need to do to be viable over the long term, let alone make a profit.
On top of everything else, then we just had in the Chicagoland area, obviously some riots and looting. We saw people taking all kinds of things out of stores along Michigan Avenue, of all places, the Magnificent Mile. And I was just looking at that and thought, at this particular time especially, how can these people ever recover in these businesses? Overall, what is the state of Illinois retail at this point in time, and how many people are we talking about? You mentioned, which was a good point, the impact of that the retail also has on local government as far as their revenues. How many people are employed in Illinois approximately in the retail businesses?
We account for 1 of every 5 workers, so 20% roughly. Now that was pre-pandemic. We'd have to go back and look at the numbers. Obviously, our industry has been hit particularly hard by the pandemic, given the closures. So I'm sure at the moment that number is not accurate, but in a normal economic setting, we're 20% of the employment in the state.
When we look at where we are right now and with this impact, what are you hearing from any of your, when we say Illinois retail, a lot of times I think people visualize things like a Walmart or like a Target where you're buying clothes, but it's really everything. You should say it's grocery stores, it's pharmaceuticals, gas stations, I guess, if you part of that. Are there different sectors of the retail industry that are going to be particularly sensitive to this increase in the minimum wage and have been especially hit hard by this coronavirus?
Everyone is impacted because everyone employs in some capacity minimum wage workers. But everyone's also impacted. You forget that just when you increase it for that beginning worker, hourly worker, you also have to consider increasing it for your more experienced workers. And there comes a point where you can't afford to do both. And so that creates a great deal of resentment upon your more experienced employees as well. So there are cost pressures for everyone. Are those who have been closed? So, when we think about bowling alleys and movie theaters and fitness clubs and dine-in restaurants, apparel stores, those have all been completely closed for some period of time throughout this pandemic, and they were kept afloat, if you will, with federal loans. Loans have to be paid back. So this just puts another impediment towards their long-term viability. And so it's going to be really interesting to see how this progresses. But it is not just, as you alluded, our membership is not just big; it's big and small. We cover the gamut, and we have everybody from pharmacies to grocery stores to restaurants to the entertainment industries that I mentioned. We truly cover it all.
Well, and in a lot of places, even before the pandemic, I just kind of thought when they passed that, and it's not to say that businesses insensitive to the income needs of workers, but a lot of these businesses, operate on very small margins, and when you increase their labor rates by mandate, without the ability of these businesses to necessarily increase their retail sales, as we've already discussed, a lot of these businesses are located in small communities. They don't have the ability to do that. What is I think the average retailer makes what kind of a profit, Rob, after you deduct all the operational costs?
Pre-pandemic, you were looking at less than 2%. Pre-pandemic.
So for every $100 that comes in the door, they may hold on to $2 at the end of it. $2. That's exactly right. Now that's an average, remember. So that's accounting for an electronics retailer who might do better because they have higher margin products versus a grocery store that has historically a very low margin, very close to 0% for many grocery stores, taverns, example. So it covers that, but it's going to hit very many very hard. And remember, this is the second increase in 6 months, and there's another one coming January 1st. So you will have seen a significant increase in Illinois' minimum wage in 366 days. I know the proponents like to sell it as over 2 years, but that's in my book, it's a year and a day. And not to be melodramatic, but I think there's probably the reality. The reality was going to be, even without the pandemic, that a lot of businesses wouldn't be able to keep their doors open. Now, one could say that we're kicking them when they're down. Do you have any idea of how many retail establishments in the state of Illinois you're just going to say, there's no point in being in business anymore, we're just going to stop operations?
No, I don't have a number for you, Terry, but I will tell you that I have had call after call after call, particularly from independent retailers, many very emotional, not all angry, many sad, crying, because they're seeing their businesses disappear and they have no viable path forward. They are, in some cases, you're lost because of this. So do they see it as a kick in the teeth, a word I used earlier, a phrase I used earlier in our interview? They really do. Not only a kick in the teeth, a stab in the heart. And I think policymakers are ultimately going to have to wonder aloud why they're having such negative revenue impacts when they look again at both their local governments and the state government, because they've really kicked, while the industry is down, their second and first largest revenue generator, which is the retail industry.
Well, I was going to say, we talk about being fair to state workers with their pensions. You have these small business people who may have had $1 million business and were perhaps 5 years away from retiring. They look to sell their business. Now, if we force them out of business because of both of the pandemic and then adding this mandated increase, you're going to have people who are losing, they're just not shutting down. They're losing the inability to sell what might have been their whole life's work of a career, to have built a business from scratch into $1 million business, and that $1 million valuation just goes out the window.
That's exactly right.
With nothing.
That's exactly right. And $1 million sounds like a lot to many of us, but in the business world, that's not a lot of money. That's a pretty small retailer at $1 million. And I, to go back to something you mentioned earlier too, we warned for years in the city of Chicago that you can do a lot of things. Businesses can afford a lot of things in the Chicago Loop, the business area, because you're getting 50 million visitors a year. The minute that tourism bubble pops, you're welcome to reality. Well, they're now facing reality because that bubble has popped. And even if you get a vaccine in the very near future, it's going to be a long time till you get it permeated throughout the population, and that the consumer becomes comfortable again to travel to that level. And I think it's going to be many years till we see many corporations, which drove some of that tourism, trade shows and the likes, that really feel comfortable even with a vaccine. So this is not just an issue for downstate. And we demonstrated previously in the past, when the economy was well, that in the city of Chicago, in that Loop area, they were doing well, but their neighborhoods were getting decimated by the same policies. Now it's going to be the Loop that's experiencing exactly what their neighborhoods and what we have been warning about for years.
Yeah, and you brought up an excellent point, which, just to mention again, when so much of the revenue goes to local municipalities, and those local municipalities that the Illinois Channel has covered for years, the impact of high pension costs on those city governments, when their revenue drops, it's going to be impacting not just the retail, people working in retail, but obviously the people like fire and police, and the ability of fire and police departments to protect the general population. What do we tell those people who are all retired, or those people who are still working on the force? Say, hey, you may not be getting your pension, because so many of these pensions are already woefully underfunded. I think the Chicago Fire and Police are down in something like 15–17% of where they should be, and that was, again, without the massive loss in revenue that now we're going to be facing. Before we close out, let me just bring up again this screen of where we are as of today. $14 an hour in Chicago, $13 in Cook County, $10 an hour everywhere else. Can you update us? Where does this go in January? What would the cost of labor be?
As I recall, for the state of Illinois, so everywhere but the city, it goes to January 1, it goes to $11.
And do you know, in Chicago, it's currently now 14. Does that go to $15, or do you know?
I believe that goes to 15, and I believe, Terry, it's July 1 of next year.
And then eventually everything everywhere across the state of Illinois is eventually going to be $15, right?
Correct. Correct.
And of course, every time you increase $1 an hour, if you have a full-time worker, it's approximately $2,000 more cost per year. There's 2,000 work hours in a year.
At the very least, right?
Without any overtime.
Correct. Well, without any overtime, but you're also talking about, the extra, there's about another 30%, that you pay, that the employer pays in terms of taxes to the federal government, the state, for the employees you hire for those wages. So it's not just a simple, we're paying an extra, in this case, 75 cents an hour, starting July 1. It's more than that.
And the sad thing is, not to belabor this too much, we'll let you go, but how many of us got our start with a job just to, so you could make some extra money in high school, even just to go out and kind of start to be independent, or work towards affording your own college education? That these jobs, many of those jobs that kind of give you the first rung of the economic ladder are going to disappear.
That's exactly right. I mean, I got my start bagging groceries, cleaning dairy shelves, stocking shelves. It helped put me through college because I had to largely pay for my own. And so you're exactly right. And then we hear policy leaders bemoan the fact that there aren't jobs available for youth. Well, this is one outcome of that policy decision. And then the response is to spend more government money to create work programs when we could have a healthier private sector to help accommodate those.
One last question. Is the policy of the Illinois Retail Merchants Association, are you going to continue to fight to try to say we need to have this rolled back? Or at this point, are you kind of just given up that the fact that there's nothing that can be done?
Well, we're going to continue to fight. But as you know, the Assembly is not in until the veto session in November, assuming, that the pandemic allows for such a response. We will push to have them review the January 1st increase again. We don't quit, Terry. We might be told no, but we don't quit.
Right. Rob Carter, thank you so much. Good luck to you and your members. This is obviously one of the most trying times, perhaps in the history of the state of Illinois, given all that we're facing. So, we always wish best wishes to you and all those out there on the front lines on the economy, trying to make it day by day.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Terry. You be safe as well.
Thanks for watching. And if you haven't already, please consider subscribing to our channel. And while you're at it, please leave us a comment. Thank you for watching.